Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. As the day wore on, the weight in his chest only seemed to grow heavier. He tried to focus on work and keep his mind off the growing concern for his daughter, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the unease gnawing at him. He found himself constantly looking at the clock, anxiously waiting for the moment he would pick her up from school. It wasn't like him to worry like this, but something in the back of his mind kept telling him that he needed to take action. All day he replayed the events of the morning over and over in his mind. He thought about how she had asked to stay home from school, something she had never done before. It struck him as odd, and her response when he tried to ask why had only deepened his fears. "If I'm not a good girl, will you still love me?" Those words echoed in his mind, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't sure where they came from, but they haunted him, filling him with a sense of dread. He remembered the way her small hands had clutched the fabric of her shirt tightly, as if trying to protect herself from some invisible threat. It was as though a part of her had withdrawn, and he couldn't understand why. That night, as he sat alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in his daughter. It wasn't just the fact that she had become distant, it was the fear he could see in her eyes. It was a fear that he couldn't reach no matter how much he tried to comfort her. The more he thought about it, the more his heart ached. He couldn't stand the thought of something hurting her, of her being so terrified that she couldn't even talk to him. He had always prided himself on being a good father, on being someone his daughter could trust. But now he felt helpless. He had no answers. The next day, as soon as she left for school, he made a decision. He would find out what was going on, even if it meant breaking his own moral code. He didn't care. He couldn't live with the fear that something was hurting her without doing something about it. He knew it would be risky, but he couldn't let this continue. He had to know the truth. His mind raced as he put his plan into action, feeling the urgency with every passing second. This wasn't just about finding out what was wrong. This was about protecting his daughter, about making sure she would never have to carry this burden alone again. He wasn't sure how, but he was going to get to the bottom of it. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to stop him from protecting his little girl. The next morning he woke up early, his mind already racing with plans. As his daughter slept peacefully in her room, he stood by the window, staring out into the gray morning. The anxiety from the previous days had now solidified into a sharp, overwhelming sense of urgency. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening to his daughter at school, it was no longer something he could just hope would go away. He had to act. The idea of confronting the school, of speaking to the teachers and staff, crossed his mind, but something told him that wouldn't be enough. He needed more. He needed hard evidence. He was no longer willing to sit back and hope for the best. Today he would do whatever it took. He had heard of similar situations, stories of children being mistreated or threatened, and no one doing anything about it. He didn't want his daughter to be just another silent victim. He couldn't bear the thought of her being too afraid to speak up, too terrified of the consequences. He couldn't let that happen to her. He had been talking to a close friend, someone who had experience in these situations, and after some discussion, they had both agreed that the only way to truly uncover the truth was to take matters into his own hands. He felt conflicted, but deep down, he knew he had no other choice. The fear that had been growing in his daughter's eyes wasn't something that could be ignored. It was time for him to make a decision that would shape everything that was about to happen. As he went into her room and helped her get ready for school, he gently placed the small recording device in her hair clip, something she loved to wear every day. He hoped she wouldn't notice, hoped she would just go about her morning routine as usual, oblivious to what he was doing. The device wasn't big, just small enough to fit in the clip without drawing attention. He told himself it was for her protection, that he had to know what was happening when he wasn't there. But as he watched her eyes in the mirror, a part of him felt guilty. He knew what he was doing was risky, but he had no other option. The fear in her eyes couldn't be ignored any longer. As he finished getting her ready for school, he looked at her reflection, feeling a mix of love, guilt, and determination. He kissed her forehead and sent her off, watching as she walked out the door, her tiny footsteps echoing in the hallway. As soon as she was gone, he felt a weight lift from his chest, but only for a moment. He knew what he had done, and now there was no turning back. He had to face the truth, whatever it was, and he would not rest until he had answers. The hours that followed felt like a blur. He couldn't focus on anything except the thought of what might be happening at school, the possibility that his daughter could be in danger, and he had no idea. His mind raced as he kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until he could finally pick her up and hear what the recording would reveal. He could barely sit still. Every second felt like an eternity. The guilt gnawed at him, and yet he kept telling himself he had done what any father would do. He needed to know the truth. His daughter couldn't keep carrying this burden alone. By the time he arrived at the school to pick her up, his heart was pounding. He parked his car and waited for her to come out. As soon as he saw her walking toward the gate, he felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety. She didn't look up at him right away, and for a brief moment his stomach turned. She was still the same, pale, distant, as though she was carrying some invisible weight. When she finally got into the car, she didn't say a word. She just sat there staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. The silence between them was unbearable. He wanted to reach out to say something to comfort her, but he didn't know where to start. What could he say when he wasn't sure what was going on? He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to catch her eye, but she kept her head turned, her eyes still fixed on the passing scenery. "Sweetheart, how was your day?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, filled with a mixture of concern and desperation. Lucy didn't answer right away. She just shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, and muttered, "Normal." Her response hit him like a punch. He knew his daughter too well. She never spoke like that. There was nothing normal about her recent behavior. He felt the weight of the recording in his pocket, the small device that could change everything, and he couldn't help but wonder, was he about to uncover something that would break him, something that could change their lives forever? The moment she spoke, his heart sank. She said so quietly that he barely heard her, "You can't help me." The words felt like a knife through his chest, and he almost couldn't breathe. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of her words. He could feel his own heart shattering as he turned to her, struggling to keep his composure. The fear in her voice was undeniable, and it terrified him more than anything else he had ever faced. That night, he barely slept. His mind was consumed with the thought of his daughter, of what she had said, and what might be hidden behind that one simple sentence. "You can't help me." The words replayed in his mind over and over like an endless loop. He couldn't shake the image of her, small and fragile, sitting in the back seat of the car, her face devoid of the usual spark that once defined her. He knew something was wrong, but he had no idea how deep it went. As he sat there, his eyes glued to the clock, the guilt and fear became almost suffocating. Every minute that passed felt like another piece of his world falling apart. He knew he had to listen to the recording, that it was the only way to uncover the truth, but he couldn't bring himself to do it yet. The idea of what he might hear terrified him. What if it was worse than he imagined? What if his daughter was in danger, and he had failed her by not noticing sooner? When the house finally fell silent and he could no longer delay the inevitable, he went to his study and plugged the small device into his computer. His heart was pounding as he clicked play, the anticipation almost unbearable. At first, there was nothing but the ambient noise of a classroom, students talking, the scribbling of pencils on paper, the shuffle of feet. Then he heard her voice, faint at first but unmistakable. It was Lucy's voice, and it sent a chill down his spine. He listened, every fiber of his being focused on what was coming next. And then, the voice he dreaded hearing. The teacher's voice. "Mrs. Dawson." "Lucy, stand up," she said coldly. There was no kindness in her tone, no encouragement, just an icy command. His stomach turned. The next few moments were a blur of horror as he heard the sharp sound of a slap echo through the speakers. It was followed by Mrs. Dawson's cruel words. "You're useless just like your father. No one will ever love you." His hand clenched into a fist, his nails digging into his palm as the rage and helplessness surged within him. He heard more. The teacher's voice filled with malice, mocking Lucy's tears, belittling her, and threatening her with abandonment if she dared to speak up. "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure your father is taken away, and you'll end up in an orphanage." He almost couldn't breathe. The tears welled up in his eyes as the weight of the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. His little girl, the one he had promised to protect no matter what, had been suffering in silence, and he hadn't known. He had failed her, and now it was too late to undo the damage. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let this continue. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her again. He didn't waste another second. The recording, still playing in his mind, was all the motivation he needed. He knew what he had to do. No more waiting, no more second-guessing himself. His daughter's suffering had gone on long enough, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence her, especially not someone like Mrs. Dawson. He quickly grabbed his phone, dialing his best friend Charles without hesitation. As the phone rang, his thoughts were racing, trying to figure out what steps to take next. He needed support, and he needed it fast. The phone clicked, and Charles answered on the third ring. "Charles, I need your help," he said, his voice strained with emotion. Charles, sensing the urgency in his tone, didn't hesitate. "What's going on?" Anthony filled him in as quickly as he could, barely able to contain the raw emotion in his voice. He explained everything: the recording, the abuse, the threats. And when he was done, there was a long pause. Charles didn't speak immediately, but when he did, it was clear he was ready to help. "You're not alone in this, man. We'll figure it out." The words were like a lifeline thrown to him in the middle of a storm. Anthony had spent so many days feeling completely helpless, but now he had someone by his side who would help him take action. He hung up the phone, his heart beating faster as he realized this was just the beginning. That night, he barely slept, tossing and turning as the weight of the situation sank in. He had done what he could to protect Lucy, but now the real work began. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Mrs. Dawson wasn't just a teacher. She had power. She had connections. And the principal, Mr. Harris, was just as complicit. Anthony could feel the fear creeping in again, but he refused to let it control him. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about making sure no other child ever had to go through what Lucy had experienced. The next morning, he called Charles again. "We need to go to the school, now." They agreed to meet at Charles's place and go together. They weren't going to let the school brush this under the rug, not after what Anthony had heard on that recording. He couldn't stand the thought of Mrs. Dawson getting away with it, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. As he made his way to Charles's house, his heart raced. This was it. He was going to confront the school, and he was going to make sure that no one, especially Mrs. Dawson, was allowed to hide the truth anymore. When they arrived at the school, Anthony felt his palms sweating, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. He had prepared himself for this moment, but now that he was standing on the doorstep of the school, everything felt more real, more intense than ever before. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. This wasn't just about confronting a teacher anymore. This was about fighting against a system, about making sure that his daughter's suffering didn't go unnoticed. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for every other child who might be too afraid to speak out, who might be suffering in silence just like she had been. He and Charles entered the building, and immediately the air felt thick with tension. Anthony had made the decision to go straight to the principal's office to confront Mr. Harris. The man had to know what had been going on in his school, and he needed to be held accountable for his role in letting it happen. Anthony and Charles walked down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. When they reached the principal's office, Anthony took a deep breath and knocked on the door. He didn't care what time it was. He wasn't leaving until he had answers. "Come in," a gruff voice called from inside. Anthony pushed the door open and Mr. Harris looked up from his desk. He seemed surprised to see them, but Anthony didn't let the shock in the man's face deter him. He walked straight in, his eyes locked on Harris's. "Mr. Harris," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "I have something you need to hear." Before Harris could respond, Anthony pulled out his phone and played the recording. The room went silent as Mrs. Dawson's voice echoed through the speaker. Anthony watched Harris closely, waiting for his reaction. He could see the color drain from the principal's face as the recording played, and when the threats and the abuse became clear, Harris's eyes shifted nervously. But Anthony wasn't done. "You're responsible for this," he said, his voice sharp. "You let this happen under your roof. You let a child be terrorized and you did nothing." Harris tried to speak, but Anthony cut him off. "I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to make sure that the people who hurt my daughter, who hurt any child in this school, pay for what they've done." The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, no one spoke. But Anthony could see the fear in Harris's eyes, and he knew that for the first time, the truth was staring him in the face. The confrontation with Mr. Harris felt like a turning point, but it was only the beginning. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Harris finally spoke. His voice was shaky, but he tried to maintain his composure. "This isn't how we handle things, Anthony. We don't air our dirty laundry in public," he said, his tone defensive. But Anthony wasn't buying it. He could feel the anger building up inside him, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He had heard enough of these empty excuses. "No, Mr. Harris. This is exactly how it's going to be handled. I'm not going to let my daughter be ignored any longer. And neither should any of the other parents here." Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly trying to find a way out of the conversation, but Anthony wasn't giving him that chance. He wasn't backing down. "You need to understand something, Harris. You're part of the problem, you and Mrs. Dawson, and I'm not walking away until both of you are held accountable for what you've done." Harris opened his mouth to argue, but just then the door to the office opened and Charles stepped in, his expression grim. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone spoke volumes. He was ready to back Anthony up no matter what it took. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. They weren't just going to sit back and let this be swept under the rug. Harris could see the resolve in their eyes, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that this wasn't something he could simply talk his way out of. The silence in the room grew heavier. Anthony stood there, his gaze unwavering, and Charles moved closer, standing beside him like a pillar of support. After what felt like forever, Harris finally sighed, his shoulders slumping. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice defeated. Anthony took a deep breath. "I want Mrs. Dawson gone. I want her held accountable, and I want the school to face the consequences for letting this happen. And I want justice for my daughter and for all the children who've been hurt." Harris didn't respond immediately, but the silence between them was deafening. Anthony knew this was the moment that would decide everything. This wasn't just about punishing Mrs. Dawson anymore. It was about showing that the system couldn't get away with abuse. It was about taking a stand. And in that moment, with Harris sitting there, Anthony felt a small flicker of hope. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to win this fight. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. The school tried to push back, claiming that they would handle the situation internally. But Anthony wasn't having any of it. He could see the cracks in their facade, the way they were desperately trying to cover up what had been going on behind closed doors. But now that the truth had been exposed, there was no going back. He spent hours on the phone, contacting other parents, reaching out to those who had remained silent for too long and encouraging them to come forward. Slowly but surely, the walls began to crumble. More victims came forward, other children, other parents who had been too afraid to speak out until they saw Anthony's courage. The support grew, and with it, the pressure on the school mounted. The media caught wind of the story, and soon, Anthony found himself in the middle of a firestorm. News outlets started calling, asking for interviews, asking for his side of the story. He felt overwhelmed, but at the same time, he knew this was his moment. The moment when he could make sure that Mrs. Dawson and everyone who had covered for her would finally face justice. The story spread like wildfire, and with it came a wave of support from strangers, from people who had never met him or Lucy, but who had been touched by their story. It was incredible. It was overwhelming. But it was also what Anthony needed. It gave him the strength to keep going, to keep pushing. In the meantime, the school was forced to act. Mrs. Dawson was suspended from her position while the investigation continued, and the pressure on Principal Harris intensified. He was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. Now, he was a man scrambling to save his own skin. But it wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough until justice was served. Until the truth had been heard by everyone. Anthony spent the next few days sleepless and restless, gathering more evidence, meeting with journalists, and making sure every single person who had been affected by Mrs. Dawson's cruelty had a chance to be heard. The battle was far from over, but with every passing day, he felt a little closer to winning. Finally, the day came when everything Anthony had been fighting for seemed within reach. The press conference was scheduled, and the media coverage had built to a fever pitch. As he stood outside the school, watching the police arrive to take action, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The storm had been long and grueling, but he could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Lucy, though still shaken, seemed a little lighter. Her smile wasn't as hesitant anymore. She was slowly reclaiming the childhood that had been taken from her, and Anthony couldn't have been more relieved. Mrs. Dawson was arrested, and soon after, Principal Harris was placed under investigation for his role in the cover-up. For the first time in weeks, Anthony allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment. Justice was being served, not just for Lucy, but for every child who had been hurt, every parent who had felt powerless. It wasn't just the victory itself that mattered, but the fact that they had spoken out, that they had broken the silence, and forced the truth into the light. As he sat with Lucy that evening watching her play and laugh, he knew this experience had changed them both forever. It had been a fight he never wanted, but one he would never regret. The love he felt for his daughter, the fierce determination to protect her at all costs, had driven him to do something unimaginable, and in the end, it had made all the difference. The past few weeks had been a nightmare, but now as he held his daughter in his arms, he knew they had emerged from it stronger, together. And that's a victory no one could ever take away from them.